So this is me on the 31st of January 2010. I'm fit and healthy, age 36. I'm a blithely able-bodied woman. But the following day I became a disabled woman. I became a woman with a brain injury. 2 blood clots travelled to my brain through a hole in my heart I had no idea I had. And I suffered a serious ischemic stroke. Well, strokes affect their survivors in many ways. Speech and language, cognitive function, memory, and motor skills. My stroke caused left-sided paralysis. It affected the parts of the brain that control audio-visual processing, and it created other neurological problems. Having a stroke draws a line across the sand of your identity. That's who you were yesterday, your damaged brain says. Who are you now? Well, I wasn't sure who I was. All I knew was that I was the owner of a body that was divided into 2. One side of my body knew everything about me, my right side. My right side knew how to hold a pen, how to play the violin, how to manipulate needles and yarn to knit a sweater. My right side knew how I'd learnt to tie my shoelaces as a child. My right side was a living repository of 36 years of physical memory. But my left side knew absolutely nothing, because the part of the brain which had once controlled it had been destroyed. And without those brain cells and those activating neurons, my left side had no function. And it had lost all memory of the countless ordinary gestures that over the 36 years I'd been alive had accumulated to make my body me. So in the days and weeks after my stroke, I often looked at my paralysed limbs and I thought about this loss of physical memory. I thought about all of the ordinary gestures that my left hand could no longer perform, on all of the ordinary objects that it no longer knew how to use. And I thought about that a lot, particularly when I encountered such everyday objects. And this is the first meal I ate in hospital, half paralysed after my stroke. And it was brought to me with a conventional plate and conventional cutlery. But I only had one working hand and what was then a very wonky body. And as I chased the peas around my plate, I began to realise how poorly my newly disabled body was addressed by these objects, by the plate and the knife and the fork. Understanding my new body was a very strange and alienating process. And this sensation of estrangement was merely increased by the crockery, by the cutlery, by the food that eluded my best efforts to consume it with the objects I'd been given. So chasing the peas around, I began to think about the inherently able-bodied nature of the design of so many ordinary tools and objects. I began to think about how tools and objects might humanise or dehumanise a body, and about how design might enhance this feeling of bodily self-estrangement, or perhaps increase a sense of embodied independence. And over the weeks and months that followed, I thought a lot about ideas of embodiment and design, and I really had to think about them, because at that point I was having to try to teach my left hand and arm to move again by drawing on the parts of my brain that already controlled the right side of my body. Now, as you can imagine, teaching one side of your brain to control both sides of your body is quite a weird and difficult process, but it was an instructive process too, because in learning how objects addressed my body, and in teaching my brain to comprehend the gestures and actions that were written through these objects, I began to develop a new understanding of my body's own creative capabilities. And I'll demonstrate what I mean with a very familiar object and a familiar process that's associated with it. So here we have 2 socks, a pair of socks, and now we have a sock ball. You've made 2 socks into one neat, self-contained sock object. Well, I bet you've never really thought about what your hands are doing when they make a sock ball, and I bet you've perhaps never regarded this as a creative object, but it really is. I mean, just think about what your hands are doing when they make a sock ball. First of all, they're exercising and demonstrating their very sophisticated thumb-index precision grip. And this is a sort of form of manual dexterity that's only demonstrated by humans and some other primates. So when they make the sock ball, your hands are also collaborating with one another. They're working together towards the same end to produce a single object. But they're also opposing one another. They're working in opposite directions. They're mirroring one another. My left hand had no function and no memory of how to make a sock ball. So this was a very mystifying process, and the sock ball was a mystifying object. So I had to get people to show me how they made sock balls, and I had to get them to break down their actions into sequence. And then I had to try to copy what they were doing for myself. It took me many days to be able to develop enough movement and dexterity just to be able to make a simple sock ball. And this was tiring work, but it was rewarding work as well. Because learning these gestures from scratch again compelled me to understand the very complex creative processes that are embodied in my brain and in my hands and in a really familiar object. I began to see this object completely differently, precisely because I'd had to make it from the inside out. So the simple movements and gestures that create a sock ball might be experienced by our bodies as habitual and as natural, but really they're not natural at all. And I only understood that a sock ball was a sophisticated product of human artifice because my damaged brain had deprived my left hand of any capacity to be able to make one. So it was only after my stroke that a sock ball suddenly appeared to me as what it really is, which is a triumph of useful invention. And if a sock ball appeared to me to be a small creative miracle, then that was as nothing in comparison to the ETAC Turner. So this is the incredible device that I used to be able to stand and sit again after my stroke. And it's made by Swedish company ETAC, who are a fantastically innovative design company, creating many different kinds of assistive devices for disabled people. So I'll explain how it's being used. So the assistant on the right here is stabilizing the turner with that upper handle and by placing their foot on the rotating foot plate. And then the disabled person is moving their lower body into position against these knee rests and maximizing what physical function they've got to be able to reach up for the handle and then rising to a standing position. And at that point, the assistant rotates the turner through 90 degrees. And again, the disabled person maximizes their muscles and activates their muscles to be able to sit down again. So when I first used this, I was completely blown away by it. And it wasn't just the sensation of being able to stand upright semi-independently for the first time that amazed me, although that was incredible enough. What really intrigued me and fascinated me about this tool is the way that there are two sets of physical requirement written into it. I needed to be able to stand and sit as independently as I could, but the assistant needed to remain upright and help me, but without bearing my weight. So in the moment of the transfer, the tool takes those two sets of physical requirement, it manages their cooperative interaction, and then it separates them once again. So through that object, two contradictory physical desires and intents act together, but with completely equal concert. So the ETAC Turner did an awful lot for me. It motivated me to useful exercise. It extended my physical function, and it enhanced my sense of bodily self-determination. So it had important physical effects, but its effects on me were philosophical as well. Because through engagement with the turner, I became intensely conscious of the way that my body acted out its intent through tools and objects, and the way that tools and objects reciprocally helped me to feel embodied. So neurological deficit and physical limitation really opened my eyes to the potential of tools and objects. And it made me appreciate their madeness and become astonished by their thingness. And I began to regard them with a newly appreciative insight. So I'd enjoyed several crafts before my stroke, and I knew something about what it meant to make things. But in all 36 years of my able-bodied life, I had never felt the same kind of humility that I did when I first stood with the help of the ETAC Turner, or when I first taught my hand to make a sock ball. Suffering serious and sudden disability is, as you can imagine, a pretty terrifying experience. But I would say that brain injury also really opened my eyes to the deeply human potential of made things and practices of making. In fact, I began to see how limitation might in itself be a prompt to creative understanding. And as I moved forward from my stroke as somebody who would always be disabled, I also began to understand that recovery from brain injury might be less about overcoming limitation than it was about finding ways of using limitation to one's creative advantage. And in my case, it was hand knitting that really enabled me to do that. So I really can't overestimate the importance of knitting to me in my post-stroke life. So knitting, for a start, held major therapeutic benefits for me. It was how I began to develop upper limb strength and how I developed many different kinds of fine finger movement and manual dexterity completely from scratch. And knitters in the audience might be interested to discover that it was only after my stroke that I began to knit routinely in the continental style. And that's a style of knitting that involves more work for the left hand. So knitting was really important for my rehabilitation. But there were other benefits to it as well. Because like many other people who suffer brain injuries, my health was subject to very severe, debilitating fluctuations due to the effects of neurological fatigue. Now, neurological fatigue is one of the most devastating, but perhaps least discussed aspects of brain injury and stroke in young people. And fatigue means that your physical and mental capabilities can vary very dramatically from day to day. It means that you can't plan ahead. You can't know today what you're going to be able to do tomorrow. And this can trap you in a really punishing cycle of frustration and regret. But because hand knitting allowed me to develop a sense of myself as being continually productive, it freed me from that cycle. When I was suffering from fatigue, I'd often feel overwhelmed by the sensation that nothing was happening. But if I was knitting, then things were in fact always moving forward. A row came to an end, a pattern repeat would change, and the sock that was on my needles would always grow just a little. The main business of my post-stroke life had to be self-care, and I found that knitting always promoted rather than challenged that goal. Indeed, I would say that there was something about knitting and the reduced pace of the post-stroke life to which I now had to adapt that made them natural companions. However fast your fingers move, knitting is always going to be a slow affair. Stitches accrete gradually over time. An idea grows into the thing that you'd envisaged, not suddenly, but by calm degrees. I was now the owner of a body that was subject to frequent relapses and regressions. But just like the project on my needles, things might stop and step backwards, but they'd step forward once again. Knitting really helped me to accept the new demands of my post-stroke brain and body, and to be able to live within their slowness. And sometimes when I was too weary even for thought, I was able to sit and just let my fingers knit, knit, knit. And there in the center of my own exhaustion, I'd know I was still moving. I am constitutionally a hare and not a tortoise. And most theories of creativity, I think, tend to emphasize hare-like qualities. The impulsive leap forward, the inventive chutzpah, the visionary idea formed from the most unlikely of connections. The hare's creative energy is enormously appealing, and I'm still a hare at heart. But I've also found that slowness and patience and thoughtfulness, all of the characteristics of the resourceful tortoise, are things that can really enhance one's creative journey. And I think that good product designers already know this. Designers who, like the talented team at Swedish company ETAC, know that in designing for the limitations of the human body, you might also design for its potential. And I think that knitters know this too, because wool that takes a sheep a year to grow is perhaps the quintessentially slow material. And if you want to be a good knitter or a good knitting designer, you've got to really enjoy the slow process. Because slowness and limitation aren't necessarily impediments to creative action. For slowness can lend free rein to the pleasures of the imagination. And approaching creativity from within an idea of limitation, just like I had to do when I first made a sock ball, can allow you to understand what something truly might become. So by engaging with objects, tools, and material processes from within the deficits my stroke had caused, this allowed me to discover that slowness and limitation were resources that I could draw on to enhance my creativity. And these discoveries made me a better knitter and a better designer. They made me better at the job that I do now. So I'm not someone who has triumphed over adversity. I'm not someone who has beaten stroke. I'm someone who struggles every day with the unavoidable effects of brain injury. 8 years after it happened, my stroke is still present to me every single day. So no, I've not overcome disability. But I am someone who has found in the terrifying, challenging, but deeply instructive experience of neurological limitation an unexpected resource for living a good creative life. Thanks.